Well, good morning, everyone. We're actually starting at a time when I can say good morning to everyone watching in the United States. Welcome to another Kepler live chat with one of our Kepler teachers. And today we have Mr. Gilmore Greco. Welcome.
Thank you.
So Mr. Greco is teaching a couple of courses coming up this fall. You can see it scrolling below. One of them is Jerusalem and Athens. It's an integrated humanities course. And so Jerusalem and Athens, if you were picking sides, I guess because of your last name, you have to pick Athens.
Yes.
Sorry, it was a little prepared.
People sometimes pronounce my name Greco, and I say no, like the wrestling. And
perfect.
That has to be figured out.
So speaking of wrestling, I know there's some pretty that you're a very large dude like me.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, in some aspects, you are larger than I am. We're both very huge dudes, and you've engaged in a few contact things in your day. So that just kind of, I guess, brings up your life. Like, who are you? You grew up unusually. I'd love to hear some of that.
Yeah, so I was born in Wichita, Kansas, and when I was 4, my folks moved to Argentina. They moved to work for Amway, and they moved because their business partner said it would be a good idea. And then in moving, they gave him power of attorney, and then he stole all their money.
Oh,
so
wow.
We were stuck in Argentina. So people often ask me, "Are you a missionary kid?" And I was not at first.
Yeah.
So eventually my folks started a Christian school, and my dad became the pastor of the international church that we attended there. I did basically all of my schooling in that school that my folks founded. And then
now, was that an English language school?
Was an English language school. My literature teacher, who I'm still good friends with to this day, she prompted me eventually to go to the college that I ended up going to, which was Gutenberg College, which is a great book school here in Eugene. And I actually work for the college now. I work as the house manager and event coordinator, and I wear a lot of hats for them.
Yeah.
And so I feel like in a lot of ways, and especially because I had this particular teacher for most of my education, I feel that even though technically BICA did not bill itself as a sort of classical education, I feel in a lot of ways, because of the way that Naomi was her name, was thinking about stuff, that I received a classical education in a lot of ways. And then I came to Gutenberg, and it's a great books college. We read, the whole curriculum is just reading the books that have influenced Western civilization. And so I had that education as well, sort of teaching me about classical education. So I moved to Eugene for college. And while I was here, I met my soon-to-be wife, Erin. And we got married my junior year, the summer leading into my junior year.
Mm-hmm.
And so now we're going to be married 10 years this summer.
Congratulations. You have 3 kids.
I have 3 kids. Yeah. We have discussed not saying their names on the internet publicly. I'm sure you could go find them. We do refer to them as Squish, Larry Boy, by his own request.
Okay.
And the Chunko, because our youngest is almost 3 months old, and he weighs 17 pounds.
Wow.
So
we had a hug buffalo.
Hug buffalo,
who was much like a Chunko, and now he is our skinniest child.
Oh, that's hilarious.
He does still have a big head.
Yeah. Yeah. So after I graduated from college, my mom told me about a teaching opportunity at the school where my brother and sister were attending. It's Faith Christian Academy. It's a classical school in Kansas City, Missouri. They are a conservatory model. Actually, now I think it's called like a shared teaching model. Basically what it is Monday Wednesday and Friday. There are classes at the school.
Right.
And then Tuesday and Thursday, students have, a school day's worth of homework.
Right.
And then, and the parents are sort of sharing the responsibility of teaching.
Yeah, I've heard several labels to describe that setup. The most common one is a university model.
Yeah, so I think so I was hired first, and then they hired my dad, who had been doing development for them, to be the headmaster. So it's not nepotism because they hired me first.
You were hired first.
And I did not.
I don't know. I feel like nepotism could go,
Yeah.
as well. You just tell your dad he owes you.
So I talked to him on a regular basis about what is this school called, and they're apparently FCA was the first, whatever this thing is called, conservatory. We called it conservatory model while I was there.
Okay.
It was the first school in that model to be accredited by the ACCS.
Oh, nice. Cool. Wow.
And part of the reason that I was hired is at the time their literature program was less than optimal. And they asked me as part of my hiring if I could rewrite their literature program.
Well, I can see you bring a lot of that enthusiasm to the courses that you're offering.
Yeah.
So how did you hear about? I'm sorry. Roll on.
Part of my contribution was writing a literature curriculum, and then eventually sort of trying to work towards more of an integrated sort of model of having sort of history and literature and theology sort of together. So that we would have more of an integrated model. And so that was part of the reason why ACCS ended up accrediting us, is because of the curriculum that I was helpful in putting together for them.
Nice. Well, you're the integration, that both of your classes are integrated humanities courses. And I would like to, soon talk about what an integrated humanities class is, like what that means.
Sure.
But first, I'd love to hear about how you heard about Kepler, what attracted you to Kepler, or what do you find attractive about Kepler right now? Because we're kicking off this fall. We've had a spring sort of term. We have a summer term coming up, but really this is the first year of our life. And we're glad to have you on board. What attracted you?
Well, my brother-in-law is he recently got his PhD in philosophy, and he's looking for, he's looking at various positions around, and he saw this Kepler thing, and he didn't think maybe it was for him. I'm not sure exactly, but he passed it along to me, and I was like, hey, here's this Kepler thing. I thought that it was like an online school, and that there would be, they would need vast numbers of literature teachers because you need more teachers in order to serve more students. And then I had a call with Scott Postma, the president, and he was like, no, we're this consortium, and people might say, what is that? The way that I like to think about Kepler is, back in the English aristocracy, you would hire a guy who knew a bunch of stuff to come tutor your kids. It's like that, but democratized and cheap, because we have this wonderful tool of the internet. So I am that cool tutor guy who would teach your kids Greek and stuff if you were an aristocrat. So basically, this is a way to sort of your status.
Well, C.S. Lewis is kind of the last generation to really do that. So your kids could be like C.S. Lewis and have Gilmore Greco as that tutor for you. I forget the name. Oh man,
I wish that I could. So I guess this sort of leads us into talking about integrated humanities. C.S. Lewis talked about how his whole deal was he learned Greek and Latin. Is that right? And then all of the other stuff he learned was because he was translating all of that stuff, right? So he didn't have a history class. He translated Herodotus. He didn't have a math class. He translated Euclid, right? I wish that I had that sort of level of
Yeah.
stuff that I could just be like, we're doing one class and it's going to teach you everything.
But we're going to get as close as possible.
Yeah, man.
And it is funny how many humanities teachers are frustrated philologists. You know, there's something about the Lewis Tolkien thing where we just, well, you know, I think that's some of your explanation of what Kepler is. We're going to have to clip that audio as a very nifty explanation of what Kepler is, because as you said, Kepler is not a school. And so then the way you envisioned that was pretty fabulous. So so you know, perhaps we've already shot the bolt on this one, but what is an integrated humanities course? Because you have 2 courses offered this fall, both integrated humanities, both worth 3 credits, where a normal year-long course is worth 1. Why is that?
So the goal of an integrated humanities course, in my mind, is you know, as you're going through, let's just take sort of American culture as an example. As you're sort of being an American in sort of American culture right now, you don't differentiate a bunch of things. You're watching Marvel movies, you're reading the New York Times, you're reading, you know, what's that guy's name? Jonathan Haidt's book on, you know, how people relate to each other. You're reading sort of popular science books. You're reading, so you have all of these things, and that makes up sort of what our culture is. It's this whole mishmash of all these different things. You know, you're reading Cormac McCarthy. You're reading Infinite Jest by what's that guy's name? Anyway, so you're reading all sorts of different things, and that's sort of how you be a part of our culture, and that's been true forever. So you don't, when you were Greek, you didn't like have a history thing. You read someone who was writing history, but you also read that alongside, you know, the Iliad, and you were also aware of Persian ideas. You know, Aristotle talks about how there were druids walking around in Athens. So you knew some about that. You knew so there's all these different little pieces that made up your culture, and you didn't think of them as sort of separate things. You had them all together.
There's a difference between integration and homogenization. And I think with you know, a lot of you know, so here we are stewing in American culture, as you know, as Canadians stew in Canadian and Mexicans in Mexican. But you know, I think we mistake the great variety of products available to us, including, like, for thoughtful people, you know, the books that you've mentioned. But you know, they're all kind of from the same broth. And so there's this, you know, there's this homogenization effect that happens where you're not really integrating. You're maybe expressing some of the same mode of thinking in, you know, toward different aspects. Where, you know, an integrated humanities education is bringing in all these different things and actually, you know, being actually truly diverse, as opposed to many of the advocates for diversity are actually just homogenizers. I tend to think that this is one of the things I've actually been talking with my drama and lyric class. We tend to think of the sort of Greek way of looking at the world as they had one mythology. And so you go, okay, who was such and such as his parent? And you like go to Wikipedia to sort of sort that out. Well, they sort of thought stuff the same way we think about Batman, right? Like you have Adam West not being able to get rid of a bomb in this like comedic, you know, hilarious, he's climbing up the side of the building. And then you have Christopher Nolan's Batman. And we sort of know that those are two different things. And the Greeks had the same sort of thing. So I think that what you're talking about with this idea of homogeny, like we know that there's a diversity in the different things that we're consuming, but somehow it's all American. Right. And then the Greeks too, like they operated in that same space, but they had sort of, you know, they had different lights who were saying the way that we should go about things, you know, Socrates and folks like that are saying this is how we should sort of approach it. And then you have other voices who are sort of recommending a different sort of approach to how you should live life and things like that. And you know, that somehow it's all American. I think we should put a pin in that. And later on in the conversation, I would like to talk to you about your upbringing, because you grew up in Argentina.
Sure.
And how that has affected your Christian walk, your your relationship with Christ and then your relationship with the church and the American
Yeah.
church. I'd be curious to unpack a good bit of that. Daniel Fukushan makes the comment that the entrance exam of Harvard in the late 1600s required a working knowledge of the great books in the original, just as a matter of course. And you all who are watching are very welcome to comment, pipe in, ask questions. We'd absolutely love your interaction. So yeah, let's save the growing up in Argentina. I grew up in Brazil. I'd be very interested to talk about that how one belongs, and I'd like to unpack some of that a little later on. But actually, right now, I'd like to talk a little bit about your course, Jerusalem and Athens.
Okay.
Because of course, just the title right there is supposed to make us think. Okay, Tertullian, what has Athens to do with Jerusalem?
Right.
Which people even argue about what that means. So I'd love to hear your take on that.
Sure.
I notice in the course description that the very first thing we see is Torah. That's the first word is Torah. So so two questions to start with. One, what has Athens to do with Jerusalem? What does that mean? Thumbnail version. And then why does your course start with Torah?
Yeah. So I think it's very common today. Let me tell a story to sort of illustrate this. I was working on my master's at Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, and oh, cool! Now it's just
you get the monologue.
So I was working on my master's on Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, and I wrote this paper on Paul talking in Galatians about the law and can it save you and so on. And there's this line that he says, the law is not out of faith, for he who does the commandments will live by them. It's something like that. I'm paraphrasing. And that's a very bizarre thing to say, is to say it's out of faith, but the people who do it will live by it. So I was curious about that. Why would he it seems almost contradictory to say that it's out of faith and then to say the one who does them will live by them. Well, if you go and look at how Old Testament scholars think about the verses that Paul is quoting, what they're saying is the way that you express your faith is through observance of the Torah, through observance of the law. And what Paul is saying in Galatians is not that only observance of the law can save you, but the law is not outside of faith. That is, the law can be the means by which you express the faith, the true faith that you have. But if you read Old Testament scholars and what they have to say about it, they sort of embrace that principle. But New Testament scholars have this picture that, what Paul is talking about is sort of a hypothetical. If you could follow the law, then that would be the case. And that's sort of the picture. And Old Testament scholars and New Testament scholars aren't talking to each other. And so understanding the Old Testament is really important, because I think that Paul is saying, now we have Jesus, right? Now that's the touchstone. Now this is the person that you have to confront and deal with. What he taught, his death, all of those things, that's what you have to wrestle with. But before there was Jesus, you had the law, right? The law was the thing whereby you confronted God and said, I hate you or I love you. That was it. So in keeping with that sort of slightly off New Testament way of thinking about things, we often think of the Torah, it's often translated instruction. And we often think of God sort of being angry and waggling his finger and saying, don't do that or whatever. But I think that the word Torah, the more that I think about this term and the more I think about, instruction even has this idea of an education. And we've sort of taken instruction and made it like disciplinarian, when really it's this whole picture of the world that you're supposed to sort of live in, and you're supposed to keep it on your head and on your hand, right? Which I think is this metaphor of it's the thing that's you're supposed to think about, and it's the thing that's supposed to inform your actions, right? And so your whole life is based off of thinking about what is this law, what is God trying to point out about himself.
So is this a part of your course? Part of your course goal is to make your students think about this stuff?
Yeah, it very much is. And so there's the difficulty, right? Because Jesus comes along and he's like, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. So how do we think about the parts of the law that are sort of essential to morality and loving God? And how do we think about, not eating shrimp, right? And the way that I think about it is, when you're a parent, you tell your kids things, and when you tell them things, they are in a certain context, right? You say, don't go out into the street. You don't mean when you're 27 and are capable of walking across the street, don't go into the street. You mean you as a little kid who don't pay attention to anything, right? Don't go into the street. So right. So we have things like slavery, that there are prescriptions for how to relate to those things, that if you sort of look at how God expects you to think about your slaves, the sort of love that's underpinning that would ultimately sort of unravel the whole concept of slavery ultimately. Right. So there are things like that where there is this expectation of you need to sit here and stew in, why did I tell you this?
Yeah.
Why did I tell you you have to keep the Sabbath? Why did I tell you you can't eat shrimp, etc.?
Right. And I think it's very interesting. Even like slavery is a great example where like when I was kind of talking about Jubilee and a lot of stuff with my kids, with my own children, it sort of becomes clear that this is not a sustainable model, right? It's if slavery were the basis of your economy, it just wouldn't work. And so ultimately it's supposed to lead us to Christ and lead us to serving each other. So that's the Torah, that's Jerusalem, right? But then there's also Athens in this course. So you have this course aims to develop cultural literacy by comparing Hebrew scriptures to the surrounding cultures of Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Greece. Students will trace perennial human themes and questions raised by these civilizations and how they answered them. Is this a comparative religion course?
Sort of. My assumption is that the biblical authors got it right.
Yeah, comparative religion, as long as we know that Jesus is king.
Yeah. But it's fascinating to me. The more that I think about the Torah, the more the things that the Torah is addressing are the exact things that all of the surrounding cultures are worried about. Let me give you one example. There's this famous passage from Zechariah that says, "Behold, your king is coming on a donkey, on the foal of a donkey." Why is he coming on a donkey? Well, he's coming on a donkey because he's not coming on a horse. And the horse is this symbol of war, right? It is, chariots, and chariots use horses. And in Deuteronomy 17, where there's a prescription for how the king is supposed to conduct himself, it says, don't buy horses. Don't go back, don't marry people who are from Egypt, and don't buy horses. And the desire of Achilles, of Gilgamesh, of Solomon, ultimately, is to be a horse king. And Jesus presents us with the donkey king. And in a lot of ways, David, even though he is a man of war, is also attempting to be a donkey king. And that is a totally, and this sort of comes even down into our day. This concern about how can particularly in this time, like, how can I be safe? how can I put things in place that will sort of make sure that nothing bad happens to me or anybody that I care about.
The kings could take care of this.
Right. The kings can take care of this, and it's very much affiliated with this sort of complaint that the Israelites have. You know, when we were in Egypt, we had cucumbers.
Right.
You know, like but also you were slaves.
So the question I have to ask though is, why is this important for a high school student to learn about?
Because this is the instruction that God gave us, right? Like, you may not be the king of Israel, but you are interested, or ought to be interested as a Christian, in the Torah that God gave you, right? And that includes the Old Testament. And if you're gonna have the Old Testament as part of the thing, you need to understand what it's talking about.
And understand what kingship is. I mean, if Christ is the King of Kings, I look at your reading list here and I see a bunch of kings. I see the Epic of Gilgamesh. I see Agamemnon by Aeschylus. I see Oedipus the King, Sophocles. You know, and so the Life of Alexander by Plutarch. Yeah. So there are all these kings, but you start with the King of Kings. Right. You start with Scripture.
Yeah, and so then you think about like Socrates and Plato, and what do they say? They say, who should be king? The philosopher, right? Who should be king in Deuteronomy 17? The person who copies the law, right? What is the correct governor of my people? The man who has copied the law out by hand, right? The one who is so invested in understanding who I am that they can communicate me to everybody. Right. And there's Jesus again, right? Jesus is it's so important to him that you understand what God was doing in the Torah. Yeah. I have thought about the fact that when Jesus says, he who hears my words builds his house on a rock. I have thought a lot about the fact, and Jesus is not saying this. I think this is me riffing on what Jesus was saying, but the sand is made out of rock, right? And so the problem with the Pharisees is not that like the verses that they're quoting aren't scripture. The fact is there's no connection, there's no holding together of all of those different pieces. And the thing that holds all of it together is love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul, mind and strength, right? And
which is really, I mean, that's what an education ought to be about, right? About a young Christian man, a young Christian woman learning to love the Lord your God in that way. And utility is not the primary reason to be educated. Far from it, right? It's about that. But I'm thinking about the utility of this because of your comment about shrimp earlier on. I was talking with Clark Widener, another one of our teachers, and he's an apologist, very active as an apologist. And so we were talking about preparing students for college, right, and for life, right, and often how Christian students are surprised by the world when they go out into it. And there are different ways that can happen, but I think that it's the shrimp just kind of makes me think of the amusing little people will attack Christians over scripture by saying, well, do you eat shellfish? Giggle, 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 which is really just so superficial and silly. Well, it seems to us, right? But that kind of thing and the thinking behind it sometimes hasn't occurred to the student, right? And so in that moment of contact, it's like, whoa, what about shellfish? Or really what they're thinking is, what about the law? How did this happen? Why did God say these things? And up until now, I've accepted it unexamined, right? And that's not every student, but that does happen.
Right.
And so something like this, a course like this, can really help prepare students to I have meditated upon the Word of God. I have meditated upon the law of God in this classroom setting, in this learning community. I think it would be a fabulous. There's definitely an aspect of being a Christian teacher that involves discipleship.
Yeah. There is a passage in Ezra where everyone gets divorced, but Jesus teaches that God hates divorce. So how do you square that? How do you square that circle? You know, and you really have to understand a lot of things. Traditionally in their society, definitely, still in our society to a large extent, particularly in homeschooling groups, women are in charge of bringing the children up, right? They're in charge of like giving the culture to the next generation. And if the culture that they're going to pass on is Baal, right? Like, yeah, divorce is awful, but it is better to have worshipers of the one true God than it is to not have people be divorced. And that's right. Like that is, and that's such an uncompromising sort of view, that if you've never sort of sat there and gone, oh, like that can really like jar people, and
we're talking about our own story, right? And that's something I think is important for students to understand, is that we're, when things like this are happening, it's that's the story of the people of God, and we are the people of God. Yeah. How did the law affect us then? How does the law affect us now? Why is it this way? And I think that sort of thing can make us confront our identity and change our Christian walk, which actually makes me want to shift a little bit to talk about your own Christian walk and your upbringing, because often, the sort of thing I'm talking about now, where you look at the story of the people of God in the Old Testament in more than just this was before Jesus times. It really helps establish your identity, right? You're part of this story and you're part of this people, and it's one people. But having an outside perspective can often help you see what the identity actually is. Right? You've been in other waters. So before we move to that, I'd like to encourage anyone who's watching, please feel free to comment and ask questions about what we've been talking about Mr. Greco's upcoming courses. But so I grew up in Brazil, and back and forth between Brazil and the United States. I'm a dual citizen. The story of my Christian walk and my family's Christian walk, my parents were not Christians. And so my mom converted right before I was born, and my father, so his conversion to Christ is basically the story of mine. And all of that happened in Brazil. There are no American Christians in my family to this day. There are only Brazilian Christians. So like my experience in my Christian walk, but also my thinking about the church, all of that has been deeply impacted by that upbringing. Now, you were brought up in Argentina, and we were talking a little bit before about off camera about dislocation. Anyway, I'd love to hear what you have to say about how you were brought up, and how that impacted your Christian walk and your Christian view.
Yeah. So as I mentioned, my folks were penniless in Argentina, and so they were stuck. And my dad was a Christian. Both my parents were Christians, or would have claimed to have been. And this put them in a situation where they suddenly had to rely on God. And my dad tells this story about how he was reading the psalm that says, he will not suffer his children to beg bread. And he, it was the end of the month. He didn't have any money. He throws the Bible across the room. Like, how dare God say this to me? Like, I'm going to have to go beg bread in order for my family to eat, So he goes down to the butcher shop, and this was a little mom and pop establishment. And the daughter of the proprietor usually ran sort of the grocery side, and then the father ran the butcher shop. So he comes in, and the light is off on the cash register, where the daughter usually is. This has never happened before. And he's like, where's, I think her name was Sol. He's like, where's Sol? And the butcher goes, oh, she just went home sick. Just take whatever you need and you just pay me next week. So, my dad, like, really took that to heart, and that really like. So I grew up in a home that sort of had the consequences of loving money, but was like deeply, you know, thankful for the mercy of God and sort of that thing.
Huh.
So that's one piece. The other piece is we always worked in English speaking communities. I look back now and I go, oh man, I wish that I had, you know, paid more attention to more Argentine cultural things. They were kind of old hat because I was just around them all the time.
Right.
I don't know anything about tango. Like I know that tango is like one of our greatest exports aside from beef. I mean, I really like the food there. But, you know, I just didn't know a lot of this cultural stuff because I grew up around English speakers. And that was the thing that our community is not you were a Baptist or you were Assemblies of God or whatever. It's that everybody spoke English, which means that we had a lot of different perspectives on what was going on in terms of anything having to do with Christianity.
Yeah, and so just to kind of make it clear to viewers, I imagine that because it was an English-speaking community, that meant it was an international community. It wasn't just Americans. It was almost everybody who was not a Spanish speaker or wasn't Argentinian.
Correct. So we had a good contingent of South Africans in our church. We had Germans who spoke English. And so they decided to worship with us instead of in a Spanish speaking church. So we really did have an international community. And because of that, like everybody had different perspectives. And I mean, Americans have a lot of different perspectives. There are a lot of denominations in the United States, and we have a lot of different denominations in our church. You know, I remember there was a gentleman named Mr. Ham who, talked to me a lot about why the King James was the sole sort of translation. And I get that, you know, like Mr. Ham was a great man, and I don't see him now but you know, I wish him all the best, and I think that he is a very faithful, you know, godly sort of person. And so I think a lot of that, the fact that there were these different perspectives really meant that, first of all, I had to really think about how I was going to think about a lot of this stuff. And the other thing was, there were a lot of people who would take you seriously and talk to you about what you were thinking about, even if they ended up disagreeing with you. There were, you know, I think about at the high school I worked and the people that the kids tended to interact with about like theology. You know, there were like 3 or 4 people whose students felt really comfortable sort of going like, okay, what about this sovereignty of God, free will thing? You know, if you had that sort of question, there were like a handful of people, you know, that students just kind of knew those are the people you talk to. And I feel like just because we had this international community, I feel like I had more of those people, and they were all coming from different perspectives.
Right. And so now you're up here in the United States. How has that affected, well, you know, first your perspective on education, but then your life with the church?
Well, so when I moved back to the States, I moved back to the States my junior year of high school to play American football. Because I am a large person, I actually did not like American football at all. I did not understand it tactically or strategically, which was the stuff that gets me excited, is like understanding, you know, that sort of thing. And they were just like, just hit that guy. And I'm like, I don't like that.
That's not me, guys.
That's not me, guys. My dad got me an interview at K-State. And I met like the guy who was in charge of their whole sports program, and he took me through the thing. But I was thinking of majoring in English at the time. And so I also met the English professor, and he calls me and he's like, how was it? And he talks to my uncle who had taken me. He's like, oh man, they had like an infinite pool and they had all these cool gadgets. And he hands the book to me. He's like, the English teacher liked the same authors. So there was a little bit of a.
So there's a little bit of the Ferdinand thing going on.
Yeah, a little bit. So, but when I came to the States, I went to a high school, and it became clear to me that a lot of Christians in the United States are culturally Christian.
Well, it's so interesting to hear someone who was in the Northwest say that, because usually, like within the United States, like I spent a lot of time in the South and in the Bible Belt, right? And so when you live there, you consider Oregon a not culturally Christian place.
Yes,
you're coming from another perspective.
Yeah. So I was in Ohio for my high school, and so like the institution we went to had Christian in the name, right? But I remember I was staying with a family, the parents actually of that who hosted me while I was there had actually started the school in Argentina with my folks when they were in Argentina. So both my dad and Mr. Sessler was his name. We're like, yeah, we got to get Gil to play football, so we'll have him live in our basement, and so this was their plan for me to buy them beach houses.
Right. Oh man.
But so while I was there, so the Sesslers had 5 kids, and only one of them was a boy, and I was like in the locker room, and one of the guys turns to me, he's like, so have you slept with any of the Sessler girls yet? Which I was like physically like hurt by that, like, really, like, this is
outrageous.
And I said, I took a beat and I was like, isn't this like a Christian institution? He's like, yeah, but we're all human.
Oh wow. Wow, a jaded 17-year-old. Goodness gracious.
Man, like Jesus is not that to me. Like Jesus is the whole deal. Like, this is not a thing that I pay lip service to. And
Jesus. Sorry, go ahead.
It just was shocking to me that there would be that kind of cavalier attitude to the Lord. So Jesus is everything to me. How did briefly, how did Argentina and your upbringing impact that? Because you could grow up in Ohio and also be convicted of that, right? No, absolutely. That's absolutely true. I don't think it was anything special about, it's not like people who live internationally suddenly have this special.
Right.
Like, I met missionaries' kids.
Yeah.
They have similar things going on as pastors' kids, Some of them do, right? I just remember very vividly. This was when I was much younger. We were doing Sunday school, and my mom was teaching Sunday school. And my mom was like, yeah, you can't really have Jesus be your savior if he's not your Lord. And I was like, what do you mean? Like, but I like playing video games.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Like, this is like, there's going to be like requirements on me that are like, but isn't there great, like I went through that whole thing of like, but I have excuses, and like, I'm once saved, always saved, and that whole thing. So I just think that, ultimately I believe that God is the one who's going to come along and grab you and bring you along for whatever story he's going to deal with you. In an academic setting, at least my experience of an academic setting, the way that works is you have to confront ideas that are way profounder than any ideas you've ever come up with, and that seem so different from what you would have thought, right? And you have to wrestle with, okay, how do I deal with that? How do I either accept that as true, or sort of reject that because the person who is coming with this is not sort of interested in serving God and loving God.
Yeah, I want to quote a heathen. The unexamined life is not worth living. I do think
Right.
that's actually an important principle
Right.
in the Christian walk.
Yes.
And as I've brought up my children and educated them, part of what I've wanted to do is to be able to shift them around, not geographically, but to shift them so that they can actually examine their
Right.
life, right?
Right.
Because I think often Christian parents, their emphasis is so much, we need to bring them up as Christians and assure them that in fact they are a part of the people of God, and that's
Yeah.
absolutely true. That's
Yes.
wonderful. But within that, there needs to be an emphasis in discipling your kids so that they are in fact examining and owning
Yeah.
their faith. So I have something I want to explore with you that is a personal indulgence. So
Okay.
the last thing we'll be talking about.
Okay.
And it's not super related to Kepler. It's just because we have this thing in common,
Okay.
which is this I guess exotic upbringing, international
Sure.
upbringing, back and forth. You mentioned off camera, and I'm gonna bring it out now. The sense of belonging. So everyone who's viewing understand that I'm indulging in a little tete-a-tete here, and that hopefully you can find enriching. But yeah, I mean, you mentioned that it's difficult to feel like you belong. I'm not sure if I'm putting words in your mouth, but
Yeah.
that really resonated with me. I'd love to hear you on that.
Well, I say that would have been true all through high school. I had friends in high school, and those are like my people. And then you leave high school, especially in an international community. Some people went to China, and some people went to South Korea, and some people went to actually half of my graduating class ended up coming to Eugene for one reason or another. But the other half, one went to Georgia, and all over the world now. So now, people ask me now, would you like to go back to Argentina? I think it would be cool to walk my family around places that I haunted as a youth. But would I want to live there? Not really.
And is it your home, right? It's not.
It's not, because the thing that made it my home were the people who were there.
Right.
And now they're in South Africa, in other parts of the United States or Canada or South Korea and China, so
how does that impact your I mean, I don't want to get too clever with phrasing, but how does that impact your sense of identity, and in particular, your relationship with the church you're at, your brothers and sisters? How does it impact how you feel about where you live?
Yeah. Well, I am very fortunate that I ended up coming to Gutenberg College, because I think one of the things that makes Gutenberg College so special is that it is, we are a very tiny college. There are, the year I graduated, there were 57 students.
And for those coming into the stream now, Gutenberg College is a Christian great books college in Eugene, Oregon.
Yeah, and our entire campus and dorm is in a single fraternity building. So there are people who, it wasn't Gutenberg College then, but they came to sort of the ministry that was housed in this building back from the 80s, and they will still come back to this house and be like, I love this house, right? And so I'm very fortunate that I do think that I have a home, and that I have experienced what it is like to not just have a group of people who I feel like I'm part of,
but a place.
I have a place.
Yeah.
And I think that Gutenberg is one of the most special things about it is you come over, we're on the top of a hill, and you come over the hill and you see the brick building, you go, oh, I'm home. Even when I wasn't living here and working here, I'm the house manager, so I actually have an apartment on campus.
Oh yeah.
Which is pretty great for me. As an adult now, I see all the scuff marks and things, and I'm like, oh, we have to take care of it. We have to take care of it. I'm sure I put, a bunch of
plenty of scuffs
on there.
Yeah. Well, so so just it'd be interesting just to note for viewers that there are so many wonderful Christian colleges that our teachers are a part of. So if you look down the list of our teachers, there are so many wonderful connections. So yeah, families could definitely add Gutenberg to their list of considerations.
Yeah. So, but I think previous to that, you're looking for your people, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I disagree with Mr. Ham about the KJV being the only translation. I disagree with my folks who are Presbyterians about infant baptism. I disagree with the Assemblies of God people about the second baptism of or whatever. I don't want to whatever that is, right? That allows that makes for speaking in tongues, right? I disagree with them about those things, and so I have this disagreement with a lot of different people about a lot of different things. But at the end of the day, I can recognize, and I think this is true of what the biblical authors are saying, is ultimately it's you loving God that determines where you're going to end up.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
And that connects back to when we were talking about your Athens and Jerusalem course. I mean, you're dealing with material. When you're dealing with the Torah, you're dealing with what forced people to say, "I love you" or "I hate you."
Right.
Right. So, as we approach the end of the stream, I would love to close with you giving us sort of a brief. You did a wonderful job of unpacking the Athens and Jerusalem course. You also have a course called the American Inheritance, which I urge folks to check out. Please check out Mr. Greco's profile on Kepler. But yeah, I would love to hear just kind of a brief little. Why should students take your class?
So the American Inheritance. So I grew up in Argentina, right? So I didn't have U.S. history in school, and when I came back to the States, I had a U.S. history course, and I don't feel like I really got U.S. history either. The thing about U.S. history is it's such a short amount of time that if you try to talk about everything that happened, it's very hard to sort of wrap your head around that. European history, I totally got European history because it's these cycles. You have man, the main focus is on God, then the main focus is on, culture, and then the main focus is on man, and then it kind of spires. You can sort of tell the story in a kind of simplified way that way. But you get into American history and Jefferson wants a national bank, and you're like, what does that have to do? Why do conservatives like tariffs? Are we against that? Or I'm confused. There's so much specific stuff that it's hard to kind of go, okay, what are we doing? And my course is based off of the best way that I process things, which is not from here are the events that happened in history, but here are the ideas that prevailed. And I believe that the American experiment began as a response to sort of the end of the English Civil War, which had a lot of consequences for state religion and the Scottish Enlightenment.
Yeah, I can see looking at your reading list, there's a lot of context. Right, the first thing in the reading list is the Magna Carta. You have Montesquieu, Reflections on the Revolution in France. So there's a lot of context given, and of course the things you'd expect to see, the Federalist Papers, Anti-Federalist Papers.
So there is this vision for the United States that I found. I was listening to Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America, and he had this quote that I have at the top there that I just think it's exactly the thing that I want to talk about in this course. He says, in America, it may be said that no one renders obedience to man, but to justice and to law. If the opinion which the citizen entertains of himself is exaggerated, it is at least salutary. He unhesitatingly confides in his own powers, which appear to him to be all sufficient. Okay, so we as Americans, or a particular sort of brand of American that I want to highly encourage people to continue sort of following, is we want to think of ourselves as not beholden to men, but beholden to law and justice. And as someone who grew up in Argentina, where there is not law and justice for most people, that has become more and more important to me. I see how we have the rule of law here, unlike Argentina. You know, our school for a long time, we didn't. My dad did not realize, but the lawyer who worked for our school just bribed people, just as a matter of course. And then he became a Christian, and then he was like, okay, well, so we've been bribing these people, so we need to think about how we're going to deal with stuff, you know?
Yeah.
But you don't have to do that here. You know, in Argentina, you would start a business and you would just be confident that by the time people could sue you for not having a license, you would be dead, because that's how slow and just horrible.
Well, it's interesting to think about the context of this sort of, you know, so the American society, there's so many, a lot of people in our circles, and people are looking at Kepler, you know, they look at, there are a lot of things in the United States, deep sins that need to be repented of, and will bring judgment on the people who live here, on us. But, you know, we think we can often lose sight of the wonderful inheritance that Americans have. You know, and in Argentina, I imagine it's the same as in Brazil. If a Christian opens a business, it's a very complicated thing, because an American Christian thinks, well, I'm just going to pay my taxes. Right. But the justice system is structured in such a way to account for the lawlessness.
Right.
The law is actually too harsh for the law followers.
Right.
You can't have a business and pay your taxes,
right.
or it takes a miracle of God, right? You can't have a business and not bribe, or so it seems, right? So it's actually a very difficult thing for Christians to process, and they're in this place where they have to really wrestle with these things. And Americans don't have to do that, and we need to see that as a gift.
Oh yeah, yes, I think that, and I think there are very deep, like you said, I mean, what he says here is, if his opinion of himself, right, that he's following law and justice, is exaggerated, right? De Tocqueville's saying, like, this is a little pretentious.
Yes,
right?
But at least thinking this about yourself does some good.
It's a little pretentious, but it's salutary, right?
Yeah.
It is good for you to pursue being beholden to law and justice over being beholden to men.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And I think, like, some of our greatest lights in the United States have been people who have been sitting there going, okay, all of you guys are trying to make us beholden to men, but we want to be beholden to law and justice. You know, we do not get to decide what. I just finished reading a series. I found that I really love The Odd Judicial Opinion. I love reading that stuff. So students will probably be subjected to probably less than I would want them to.
Okay.
But they will probably read opinions. And I just finished a book of Antonin Scalia's opinions. And the thing that Scalia keeps saying is, you guys, you other judges in the Supreme Court, you guys don't make the laws. Okay, you keep trying to say, we know what's morally right, so we're going to tell everybody how to live their lives. And he's saying, no, guys, like, the people get to decide.
Well,
our job is to say, this follows the law or this doesn't follow the law. The people will sort it out. Like, trust the people that they are, like, that it works, and that they will figure it out, and they will make moral laws. But
so this actually, I believe we have found, if you're willing to come back in a few weeks, we definitely need to do this again. And I think we found the topic. I think what we need to talk about is the American inheritance, law and justice, and Christ being king. How do those ideas interact? Let's definitely do that.
Right.
Well, Matt, I've been so glad to have you here, and glad we were able to connect personally. Thank you for everybody who's been watching. And so please do check out. There's a link at the bottom of your video, in the description of your video, to Mr. Greco's teacher profile. Gil, thanks so much for being here. Stay on the line after we end the broadcast, and we can chat a little bit as we end. Thanks, everybody. So long.
Bye.